Would you look who we have next? It's me. So my name's Jay. I work for the Supervising Scientist branch here in Darwin. And today I'm going to talk to you about Sarah. I'm going to be talking to you about, there's actually quite a nice follow-on from Longbin's talk, which is about, I'll be talking to you about developing restoration standards to ensure long-term ecosystem sustainability. So trying to unpick and how do you measure sustainability as a restored ecosystem progresses. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands and we're meeting today, the Larrakia people, and the lands on which this work was conducted, the Mirarr people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the contributions of our colleagues and collaborators. There's quite a large list there, so it just shows the level and the importance of getting criteria right for mine site restoration. The focus of ecosystem restoration has shifted from sort of this solely view of vegetation composition and structure, and it's moving towards a more holistic, or has moved to a more holistic understanding of the entire ecosystem, including its processes and functions. However, sustainability goals are often less represented for mine site closure criteria compared to the vegetation structure and composition. Kakadu National Park is located approximately 200 kilometres east of here. It is Australia's largest national park. It's dual UNESCO World Heritage listed for both cultural and ecological values. It's been continuously inhabited for over 60,000 years by Aboriginal people and continues to be this day. There are Ramsar listed wetlands and also a diverse range of ecosystems, which makes this area very critical in terms of environmental protection and has many, many values. Also located in the park is Ranger Uranium Mine. And this mine has ceased operations this year, but was operational for 40 years and is situated on Aboriginal land of the Mirarr people. There's high societal expectations for environmental protection of this region, and therefore there are legislated environmental requirements that require the site to be revegetated on the disturbed areas to form an ecosystem with the long-term viability that would not require a maintenance regime different from that of the surrounding Kakadu National Park. So the key term highlighted there is long-term viability, because that refers to sustainability, or how we define it. So this is the timeline for restoration. So at the start of this year, milling has ceased and rehabilitation works have started. By January 2026, rehabilitation works are to be completed. And there's sort of this unknown period after that as to when sign-off or closure sign-off will be given. And there's also an unknown period of time when full ecosystem development will occur. And this will likely take over 100 years. So therefore, there's this need to ensure restoration is progressing towards a functioning end state if closure assessment is undertaken prior to the full development of that ecosystem. So what is sustainability of a mine site? For Ranger, as I just said, this means that the site must require a management node different to that of Kakadu National Park, so it must function the same. But clearly you need a defined goal for your function and your processes. So depending on the levels of the functions and the processes that ecosystem requires will determine your objective in the end. So for example, you can have a fully sustainable ecosystem that has completely altered species composition compared to its reference ecosystem. But that may be the level of sustainability that you require. But sitting underneath that, you need to define a set of indicators or measures for that sustainability. So some examples of sustainability indicators, or how you go about measuring sustainability. I've separated them into two categories. So the first is ones that are measured through time. And these are ones that you can go back to the same site, whether that's on the restored area or in the reference community. And you can measure these things and how they progress through time whenever you want. So that would be things like rates of nutrient cycling, recruitment and reproduction, phenology, which is flowering and fruiting of the vegetation, and fauna, which for a botanist, it's pretty rich for me to just stick fauna under one single dot point. Obviously, these animals have their own set of indicators that are very important. And then there's this other category of sustainability indicator that are things that are measured in response to disturbance. So obviously an ecosystem will have its inherent resilience and regeneration capacity, but that isn't really tested and you can't measure it fully until, for ecosystems in the top end, a cyclone comes through or a large fire event is put through the site. And it's also important to note that the true complexity of an ecosystem can't be restored with only vegetation. It's quite a simplistic sort of view that you need to consider and track the progress of ecological processes, because otherwise things like pollination and seed dispersal won't come back into the site. So if you don't have mechanisms to capture the faunal usage of the site, then you may miss those key ecosystem processes that may not be occurring. So there are a few considerations you need when developing these indicators. Firstly, does the indicator need to exactly replicate the reference condition? Or does it more simply need to function similarly to that reference ecosystem? So an example of that would be soil biota. You can have completely different species composition of soil biota compared to a reference ecosystem, but they may provide the exact same functions or similar functions to that previous community. So it's about defining your goal around that. Another consideration, is it a simple yes or no, or sort of black or white question, or is it something that's measured on a trajectory or trending towards a goal? So an example of that would be a simple yes or no question is, are your framework overstory species flowering and fruiting? Are they reproducing? Yes or no? Or an example of something trending towards a goal would be rates of litter decomposition. You can measure that through time, and ideally you see the rate of that increasing. It's also important to understand how you're going to measure these things, and to know that the technology is advancing very quickly, especially in the drone world and in the genomics or omics space. And also combining that with AI. That's quite an emerging field, and we're working on projects with Microsoft in order to identify plant species at the landscape scale. So measuring things like phenology of tree species can be done at the landscape scale in the future. It's also important to understand the site-specific context. So the inherent dynamics and stresses and drivers in the surrounding ecosystem, they're important to know in order to track and know where your ecosystem should be in terms of those drivers and how it's progressing through time. And also stakeholder engagement is key. So for Ranger Mine, our collaborators and stakeholders meet fortnightly to discuss these issues, and we discuss what indicators, how we think these things should be measured, and how they're assessed. We also have run and are continuing to run independent facilitated workshops, which includes these stakeholders plus scientific experts. SSB, the supervising scientist, is developing a restoration standard, which the framework is from the SERA restoration standard. The Northern Land Council are developing cultural indicators for inclusion in closure criteria. And if you didn't catch Chris Brady, Justin O'Brien and Peter Christopherson's talk yesterday, that was fantastic. They were talking about different ways and how you can rebuild the landform and the landscape to include things like song lines and reconnecting significant places which would not be captured in these sort of vegetation and fauna surveys. And ERA, the mine operator, are developing the closure criteria for the site. And all of these things are quite tightly interlinked. So going back to ranger specific, so in the top end, the savanna woodlands are very dynamic systems, and they're influenced by many abiotic and biotic factors. So things like seasonal drought or the interannual variability in rainfall. There's frequent fires in these systems, and that also varies in intensity. There are sites that are impacted by weeds, feral animals, pests and diseases, and also extreme weather events are common in these areas. But the research from the broader region suggests that these ecosystems are reasonably robust in the face of these stresses, but obviously there are some exceptions with transformer weeds, changing fire regimes and things like that. But what about a young restored ecosystem starting from ground zero? How is this site going to interplay with these drivers and stresses, and how do you expect restoration to go on a bare waste rock landform? So clearly you need to ensure and track those development of those functions and those processes through time and ensure that they continue to develop. And a way of doing this is with a state and transition model. So the diagram on the right was developed by Anna Richards and others. And basically it shows in the green boxes, there are these, and this was a state and transition model developed by experts in a workshop. And basically it shows that in the green boxes, there are these identified desired states that move through different ecological timeframes. But there are also these deviated states in the blue boxes that, due to different processes or lack of management, these sites can become undesirable or deviated. And so with this sort of framework, you can map along the timeline when you expect different development of processes and functions to occur. So for example, I've got litter decomposition. I think you'd probably expect some form of litter decomposition to occur in the early stages in the establishment, so probably before 10 years. You would expect flowering and fruiting of framework overstory species to probably occur in the intermediate stages, and things like tree hollow development would occur in the very late stages of a mature ecosystem, which would bring in hollow-dependent fauna. You're also able to test and see whether these environmental stresses, such as cyclones or fire, when they're present in the system, whether the site moves towards these deviated states. You have these set of measures that you can test and see whether your site is progressing and these functions are progressing too. So the next steps for Ranger are to reach consensus with stakeholders on what indicators or what measures will be used to define sustainability and what sustainability looks like in the future for Ranger. There'll also be a process of informing an adaptive management plan for the site, which will ensure ongoing sustainability and the development of those processes, as well as utilising data from broader mine restoration contexts in the region. And if you missed Kate Harry's talk on Narwhal yesterday, that's an example of an uranium mine that's very similar to Ranger that we can use data for to inform Ranger. So thank you. Any questions? Dave's got the mic.
Set up. Just a bit of confusion in my mind. When the rehab or the restoration is occurring and the final processes, all the analogues are at a natural ground level scenario. What's the depth of the pit and the height of the spoil? Because we've got different ranges there, and some of the mines I'm used to in Queensland are up to 500 metres higher than the surrounding landscape, which to me is almost another ecosystem.
Yeah, so the final landform is actually going to be quite flat. I think slopes are less than 2 or 3% across the whole site. So and besides a few minor drainage lines. the depth to waste rock will vary from, so the depth to the natural surface will vary from, I mean, there's definitely going to be some sites that are on natural surface, but then that, I think in the pits, that's almost down to 200 meters or something. In terms of, well, yeah, it also depends on how the species can penetrate the root system. And yeah, there's the water holding, if you're talking about like water holding capacity or, yeah, sorry, I'm not.
No.
Yeah,
sorry.
It's flat.
Yeah, Jay, just tell him it's all the pit is filled. No, there's no pit anymore.
No.
Yeah, all the waste piles being put into the pit. Yeah, there will be no void. Quite unusual. Yeah, they're filling the pits now, and yeah. No, I mean, that's the thing, there's always expansion of spoil, so generally left with more if you put it back in the pit.
And infrastructure.
Yeah, and infrastructure.
And infrastructure goes into the pit as well.
I'd encourage you to chat with the friendly people at the ERA booth, I guess, if you have more questions about the mine operations.
So very different to Queensland coal mines. Yes.